was at the time. And basically, we did a bit of kind of IT work, looking at taking this concept of the idea that you would live a 10-minute walk and 10-minute walk back from all the kind of core things that you might have or you might like to have within your where you live. And effectively, we thought nothing much of it after that point. COVID happened, and then we spent quite a bit of time working with the city, looking at its kind of COVID responses. It's emergency active travel funds, it's pop-up bike lanes, and our starting point for this research, which I'm talking about today, was the backlash that kind of happened as a result of those schemes. I became fascinated by the kind of the negative response and how you respond to those negative responses. So from pop-up bike lanes, when they weren't being used, all that kind of thing, the pushback against low traffic neighbourhoods. I was fascinated in Liverpool. This is a guy called Steve Bradford, who is the leader of the Liberal Party, who less than 9 months earlier was one of the key founders of the city's climate emergency and was celebrating the withdrawal of one of the core lanes, which created the city's DFT funding, and still is. I was fascinated by how you could basically overcome this backlash. Then, because of this 15 and 20-minute city research that we've done, so it's it's fairly interchangeable. 20-minute city is a 10-minute walk out back. 15-minute city is just a 15-minute walk. We were asked by the conversation to write an article in response to the various conspiracy theories that we're doing around about 15-minute cities, the idea that it's some kind of Stalinist scheme to keep us all within our where we live, so we can't leave. I've been to communist Eastern Europe, and there's nothing like that. But what happened when we wrote this is the inbox died for about 4 days. I had people emailing my boss, basically trying to get me sacked. It was insane. But what we noticed in this kind of affirmed one of our kind of core questions, which is that amidst the, to be honest, there was some fairly reasonable comments in there. People who had fairly reasonable, sensible criticism of these kind of schemes, and it kind of affirmed the question which we're kind of dealing with here in our research, which is how can you abstract, how can you get to the bottom of the reasonable critique, the reasonable concerns, and deal with those in a planning context, while also then just parking all the kind of the unreasonable people who can't be reasoned with, don't want to be reasoned with, quite often just want to spam your inbox and try and get you sacked. So we did this. It was a Decarbonate funded project between us, so myself and Rich, bringing some of our research on 20-minute cities, bringing some of our analysis of the active travel funds, particularly in Liverpool, and colleagues at John Moore's. So John Moore's, they had an ERDF project which monitored some of the city's bike infrastructure over the last kind of 5 years or so, using sensors. So sensors, mounted on lampposts, that would kind of physically count people coming back and to. And we basically tested the idea, can we work together? Can we mix the kind of hard sensor data, hard data which just physically counts how people are moving, with kind of softer social science planning techniques to look at how you might kind of approach this in a planning context. So the objective of our project, which ran in 2021, was to look at how you could use sensor data to understand patterns of movement in a neighbourhood over the course of about 6 months or so, day to day, hot weather, cold weather, wet weather, weekends and so on, to understand how people move, and then can you use that data to then inform how residents in those places feel about where they live, and try and give it a kind of data-driven approach. That was the core idea of the project. What I'm going to talk about today is how that kind of went. So there was two parts to our project. Basically, we had two sensors. Each one cost about £15,000, so not exactly cheap. But they were up in Toxteth, an area of Liverpool, for about 6 months or so, just running day and night. And they captured mode of transport, direction. They could capture turning, so whether people were turning through a junction. We'll talk about that in a minute or two. Speed, and obviously things like time of day we could abstract against weather. And then we use that data to inform co-design workshops with residents in those areas. So to work with them, sit with the data with them, talk it through with them, and see how they responded to that. So this is our site. For those of you who know Liverpool, it's an area called Toxteth, just to the south of the city centre. So the city's centre's kind of up here. Quite a big site. We partly picked it because Sustrans were using it for the Liverpool neighbourhood project as well, because Sustrans were one of our project partners. And we put our sensors after quite a long sort of period of one here and one here. So this site, number one, is a site called Kingsley Road, where this is a school with a zebra crossing here. So we wanted to see how cars interacted with both the school during the school run times and the zebra crossing itself. And then here, Hartington Road, which is that's got a modal filter on it. So we wanted to understand how traffic and cyclists use the modal filter. We deliberately left this well alone because that was Sustrans' core project area, and we wanted to stay well away from what they were doing. So we spent a long time thinking about Kingsley Road, and then the day that we put our sensor in on the lamppost, Liverpool City Council announced it was going to do a what's called TRO, like the kind of temporary road restrictions, turning it into a one-way road with bi-directional segregated bike lanes. So it was kind of the wrong place for us in terms of doing our study, but kind of the right place in terms of we actually had a sensor up as they were doing this interaction, and it basically allowed us access to Liverpool City Council in a way that we didn't have before. I can tell you a story about how one of their officers direct messaged me on Twitter and kind of freaked out. But that's maybe not for this presentation. The data, a lot of the sensor data was what you would expect. Traffic patterns were more or less what you would expect, a massive peak around morning school run time, dropping off, and then a kind of slower, slightly longer peak around afternoon school run time, sort of from about 3 o'clock to about 4. Weekends were just kind of sort of amorphous, really, sort of bigger peaks in the day. I've just noticed Liverpool tends to sort of start at about 11 o'clock in the morning. Nothing ever really happens before then. Usage, what we found, Kingsley Road, this is the site with the intervention. What we found is that the intervention basically doubled the modal share for bikes quite quickly. Hartington Road, which is site 2, the one with the turning. Basically, it was an exact replica of the city's modal split, of Toxteth's modal split. It was almost identical to the percentage. It was a fairly accurate representation of how people were moving by what mode. One thing we found that was interesting was speed. It wasn't necessarily fast. Hartington Road, we thought it'd be a lot faster than it was, but it said that it wasn't. But on Kingsley Road, it was something like 97% of cars broke the speed limit. It was a huge amount of cars that were breaking the speed limit. It might have only been by 2 or 3 miles an hour, but no one was going under 20 effectively. Turning on Hartington, the sensor could measure whether cars were turning left or right. All much for muchness. What we found though with the sensor, this is where the modal split was, and we found that over the course of an average week, 7 cars drove through the modal filter, as they do. Sadly, we don't have video footage; we just have the counts. But the modal filter effectively wasn't working. That data, we used it to inform our co-design workshops. So what we did, we basically we left Kingsley Road well alone because Liverpool City Council had its own consultation on this street, and we just didn't want to interrupt that. We thought it wasn't right. What we did, we leafleted every single postcode on Hartington Road with an invitation to attend our co-design workshop. This is the leaflet. So we had CGI made of the street. This is the road with the modal filter. But every house in Hartington Road got one of these. I know they did because I delivered them personally. And what we did in our co-design workshop was it was like a sequential discussion through this data. So the residents that came, we started in every instance by asking them about their own perceptions of the data, what they thought the traffic patterns were, and so on, and then basically showing them the data in real time. So we taught them, started with the traffic patterns themselves, the kind of the distributions. Then we took them through a discussion of our mapping that we had of the 20-minute city in terms of their neighbourhood. So this is for the Hartington Road area, and effectively, the darker the colour, the more services you have within a 20-minute or 10-minute walk out and back of your city. So we asked them about it first, how do you feel that is? And then sort of taught them about the kind of reality. Then we used that as a springboard for some kind of co-design, and we showed them, these are the kind of best two, but we showed them a variety of kind of interventions on the street. So based on the kind of information we kind of talked to you about with internal traffic and so on, how do you feel about these interventions? How do you feel about, you know, the City Council potentially doing that on your street? Resident perceptions were quite good, to be honest. One of the things they really picked up on, they weren't really interested in 20-minute cities, first and foremost. They were really interested in litter and fly tipping on the street as an actual perception of their street. That almost everybody kind of picked that up as a first and foremost thing. What we found, though, the thing that was really interesting, the perceptions of traffic data were stunningly accurate. Stunningly accurate, to the point where one resident said, oh yeah, after about 5 o'clock, it's about a car every minute. Comes past our house, we can hear it. And it was like 58 cars an hour come past the house. Like really, really accurate perceptions of their data. What we found beforehand, they were suspicious of the CGI. Really suspicious of the CGI. I love this quote, you know, the picture on your leaflet looks like utopia, or maybe some affluent part in Liverpool where an issue like this would be addressed ASAP. And it was literally a scale model of their street with their house in it. They didn't believe that it was their street. But once we kind of talked it through with them and we kind of showed them, you know, kind of allowed them to position it, the CGI was actually really helpful of putting them into place, kind of visualizing what the street would look like, visualizing. They would then talk about how they would live in that space. They talk about where their kids would play, how they would interact with it, and that afterwards then moved them broadly in favour of potential intervention. I guess the big question is then how they would feel about that if it happens, but they kind of became broadly in favour of it. Getting engagement, like everything in social science, is really, really hard. Timings were hard. When do you do it? Do you do it in the day when everyone's at work? Do you do it in the night? Also, it turns out the time we picked was when Liverpool were playing in the second leg of a Champions League semi-final. We didn't know that a month in advance. Toxteth is a really kind of multi-ethnic community, so language was an issue. How do you communicate with you know, people that quite often don't have English as their first language? That was quite hard for us with a project with quite a small budget and quite a limited amount of time. That's something I guess that local authorities can do. We were really, really conscious about running this and not promising something that we can't do as well. We were really, really keen to try and frame it in a way that we're not from the council, we're not going to build these things, and particularly in the context that there were active projects going on in the area as well. It kind of hamstrung us quite a lot that there was a live consultation going on literally one street over, and how do you deliver a kind of project with that? And we found that because of that project, while initially we had project partners that were keen to share, Liverpool were very keen to see our sensor data, but not as keen to maybe allow us access to their own data. For example, that's I think a real problem with this kind of work as well, is that if you're a strategic actor, you've got a level of power. We saw that as well, even with Sustrans trying to interact with Liverpool City Council, with a kind of a power dynamic. We were one was kind of at the lower rung of the chain. We did eventually manage to get access to Liverpool City Council's consultation process as well. We agreed to provide them with the data to inform the consultation on Kingsley Road, and that sensor data in the context of it was a formal council-run consultation run sort of sequentially over about 6 months' time. The data, we were told, basically flipped resident perceptions when they first did the scheme, and basically people woke up one morning to this scheme being in place. There was 60-40 against at the first consultation meeting. They became 60-40 in favour of by the end. From seeing the data basically on Kingsley Road, that this halved traffic on the road, like almost overnight, halved it from about 5,000 cars a day to 2,500 cars a day. The scheme has been retained, partly on the basis of some of that evidence as well. It's still ongoing, partly some of the kind of the kind of backlash against 20-minute city sort of things. But our relationship with Liverpool City Council hasn't changed at all, really. They took that data, and that's it. Thank you very much. So core messages, final kind of thoughts. The good, I think, the good kind of lessons. Sometimes this kind of intervention is about the simple things. Residents who are kind of really fixated on simple things like litter, streetscape. It doesn't have to necessarily be about big infrastructure. And residents have very good instincts about there needs to be an element of trust in that as well. People intrinsically know more about where they live than we would as outsiders, because they live there. The sensor data is really what turned heads. It was useful, was a kind of very useful data set. CGI did turn heads as well, maybe less so than the sensor data. The bad, though, with this kind of project, very expensive. To be honest, £15,000 per sensor is a lot of money, and it took probably 3 or 4 months leading to get a sensor up on a lamppost. So if you're looking for something quick, for a quick consultation, it's probably not the project that you might need. And external actors were a real kind of problem in this kind of project, knitting together that kind of consortium. The kind of bigger, more complex questions, though, and I think it feeds into the heart of some of these kind of protests around 50-minute cities, 20-minute cities, is who is this consultation for? As planners, consultation is often focused on residents, people who live on the street. Well, these two streets were thoroughfares in the city. You could argue that they're rat runs, perhaps, but they're thoroughfares. So you've got 150, 200 people that might live on a road who are targeted for consultation, but quite often the people who might be affected by an intervention are the people who travel through that for work. And there's the kind of core question is, whose rights matter more? The people who live on a street, the people who would get a right of response in a consultation, or the people who live in a city and the people who therefore would travel through it. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.